What could a key weighing nearly 8 kilograms possibly lock? It would not open an ordinary door. Even the gates of a fortress would be too small for it. An old record from the archives of Northern Baden tells of a discovery beneath a monastery. At the end of the 18th century, an underground gallery collapsed there. Workers cleared the rubble and saw a heavy iron object embedded in the wall. It resembled a key to enormous gates. The monk who kept the library ledger noted a strange detail. He wrote that such gates no longer existed. Later, someone crossed the librarian's own name out of the church records. At the time, no one was disturbed by this story. Europe was living through wars, famine, and epidemics. Old iron seemed trivial. But nearly 200 years later, a filled-in hall was discovered beneath the same monastery. The floor was covered by a dense layer of gray dust. It lay as though a scorching flow had burst into the room. 3 more keys were found in the dust. Each was as long as a human arm. Each had an intricate pattern on its bit, and each weighed so much that it was difficult to hold with one hand. None of the keys fit any known doors in the monastery, nor were there any locks of the required size. Thus arose a question that sounds far too unsettling. What exactly did these keys lock? Old European engravings often depict buildings astonishing in scale. Tall arches, heavy stone vaults, windows above the level of the second, and sometimes even the third floor. Doors beside which a person looks small. Such structures can be found in Prague, Vienna, Krakow, and dozens of other cities. They are usually explained by the tastes of the era. The authorities, the church, and wealthy families wanted to demonstrate their power. That is a reasonable explanation, but it does not answer every question. Why do some individual door leaves weigh hundreds of kilograms? Why were iron rings the size of cartwheels installed in underground chambers? Why were certain passages later narrowed with masonry? Supporters of mysterious theories see traces of an unknown civilization here. Historians more often speak of warehouses, casemates, gates for cargo, and defensive structures, and yet the keys themselves compel us to look more closely at the details. Enormous hinges are often still preserved on old doors, yet locks of the same size have almost entirely disappeared. They may have been replaced during repairs. Metal was often melted down during wars. Old mechanisms were dismantled when buildings changed their purpose. But some accounts seem especially strange. Travelers' records from the 19th century contain references to underground doors in Transylvanian palaces. They described iron doors resembling city gates. Dark corridors stretched beyond them. Nearby lay massive rings and parts of locking mechanisms. Such texts cannot be accepted without verification. Many manuscripts have not reached us intact. Some accounts were retold years later. Some became overgrown with legends. But the interest in underground spaces is entirely understandable. Old European cities truly conceal whole layers of the past. Beneath modern streets lie cellars, former ground floors, and buried passageways. Windows end up almost at sidewalk level. Doors become entrances to basement rooms. Usually there is an earthly explanation for this. Over centuries, cities raised the level of their streets. People repaved roads. They brought in soil. They built new houses atop old foundations. Rivers flooded and left behind silt. Fires brought layers of ash, brick, and debris. After major destruction, neighborhoods were often rebuilt higher than before. But in some places, the layer of earth appears too dense and uniform. It resembles not ordinary urban debris, but a mass deposited all at once. This is precisely what theories of a great catastrophe are built upon. In the Chronicles of Northern Italy, there is a description of a black storm at the beginning of the 18th century. A priest named Lorenzo Berti wrote of gray, hot dust. Afterward, several streets had to be excavated by hand. The doors of houses were buried beneath the rubble. Officially, such incidents are linked to fires, collapses, industrial ash, or volcanic dust. Yet similar accounts are found far from one another. Czechia, Poland, Austria, the lands of the former Russian Empire. One detail repeats in them all. A dense gray mass fills streets and basements. Afterward, people complain of heat, smoke, and heavy air. And the same gray dust lay beside the keys beneath the monastery. This does not yet prove a connection. The dust could have reached the site after an ordinary fire. It could have been a trace of a collapse or furnace production. But the coincidence looks disturbing, especially if we recall that the underground chamber turned out to be completely isolated. There is another controversial point. Some researchers draw attention to the composition of old metal objects. Certain samples contain impurities that require high temperatures during smelting. But this does not necessarily indicate secret technology. Metallurgists of the past knew how to create complex alloys. They used furnaces, charcoal, and the accumulated experience of masters over many years. At the same time, the quality of metal varied greatly from region to region. One successful specimen does not rewrite the entire history of technology. Something else is far more interesting. The bits of some large keys show signs of wear. This means they were not merely made for ceremonies. They were actually used. The key was turned in a lock many times. Where are those locks now? Perhaps they were dismantled. Perhaps they remain behind sealed walls. Or perhaps some of the finds were described incorrectly altogether. And what we have are not keys, but parts of unknown mechanisms. The boldest theories lead even deeper, beneath old cities. In Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century, workers allegedly discovered a bricked-up passage while renovating an administrative building. Behind the wall was a round room without windows. It was covered in a black deposit. In the center stood a thick metal door. Retellings of the story speak of an enormous keyhole. The door supposedly bore a symbol, a circle from which rays spread outward. It resembled the sun or the face of an old clock. Documents concerning the discovery have not been preserved in public access. Therefore, the story remains an urban legend. Yet similar symbols do in fact appear on door fittings, coats of arms. Their meaning may have been religious, astronomical, or simply artistic. Old archives sometimes mention great keys, iron gates, and locked cellars. However, they rarely specify what lay behind them. In some cities, access to underground spaces was controlled by the council, the military, or the church. This too does not necessarily imply secrecy. Underground, they may have stored grain supplies, weapons, documents, and valuables. There could have been prisons, crypts, or dangerous mines. But prohibitions always give rise to rumors. Some legends speak of underground machines. Others tell of repositories of ancient knowledge. The darkest versions call these places shelters after a great catastrophe. And in almost all such stories one image recurs: a heavy metal door, an enormous lock, and a key that leads not into a treasure chamber but downward, into a tunnel, into a mine shaft, into a corridor whose true purpose has long been forgotten. Reports of such discoveries sound unsettling, yet they are almost always difficult to verify. The story of a ruined French abbey, a staircase leading into flooded halls, and a rusty door with an enormous key. There is no exact name of the location, no excavation report, no data on the composition of the metal or the reason for people's illness. Yet the detail of sealed gates is not accidental. The image of a closed underground door appears in the legends of many countries. In tales, treasure, dangerous knowledge, or some kind of power is hidden behind such gates. Russian chronicles, too, contain images of iron gates beneath a mountain. Sometimes they are associated with calamities and the end of the familiar order. Historians generally consider such stories allegories, and there are reasons for that. Medieval authors often described war, famine, or epidemics through vivid symbols. Chains, wheels, and heavy keys could signify not an actual mechanism, but the inaccessibility of a mystery. But real large doors did exist. They were installed in fortresses, mines, warehouses, prisons, and water supply systems. Heavy doors protected passageways from enemies, water, and fire. Sometimes they were operated by chains, pulleys, and counterweights. Therefore, a large key alone does not prove the existence of an ancient machine. High locks were not necessarily made for giants either. They could have been placed higher to make breaking in more difficult. And stairs, a platform, or a ladder led to the mechanism. In castles and cathedrals, many openings seem enormous because architects wanted to emphasize the patron's power. Gigantic dimensions do not always point to forgotten technologies. Sometimes they point to status. And yet the underground spaces of old cities truly hold many mysteries. The Paris catacombs stretch for hundreds of kilometers. They are former quarries where limestone was extracted for centuries to build the city. Later, some of the tunnels were reinforced. Human remains were moved there from overcrowded cemeteries. Beneath the streets of Naples lie ancient quarries, water reservoirs, and shelters. Huge cisterns have survived in Istanbul. They were built to store water. Odessa has extensive catacombs, Most of them emerged after the extraction of shell limestone. Such labyrinths are impressive, but their scale is explained not by a secret civilization, but by the long labor of thousands of people. Cities grew over centuries. Stone was constantly needed. Underground voids remained. They were then adapted for new purposes. By the way, if you are interested in such details, subscribe to the channel. Here we separate the real mysteries of the past from stories that sound spectacular but do not withstand scrutiny. Stories like these often mention melted stone and traces of intense heat. This is an important detail. To melt quartz, an extremely high temperature is required. An ordinary city fire rarely produces such an effect, but traces of a glassy surface can appear for other reasons as well. For example, from the operation of furnaces, from metal smelting, from a lightning strike, from contact with hot industrial waste. Sometimes a researcher sees an unusual crust on a stone and draws a sensational conclusion before laboratory analysis. A real mystery begins not with a legend, but with an examination. Rock samples are needed. Metal analysis is needed. Precise dating of the layer is needed. Without this, talk of underground reactors and power stations remains only speculation. Beautiful, frightening, but unproven. The story of engineer Karl Ebert, who supposedly surveyed a mine near Leipzig in 1842, raises the same questions. Retellings speak of a door made of an unknown alloy, a faint hum, and missing pages from a report. Then comes the engineer's death near a railway bridge. But such a story must have a verifiable basis. Where was the report kept? In which archive? Who saw the document in its entirety? Which newspaper reported Ebert's death? Until there are answers, a retelling cannot be turned into a historical fact. The same applies to stories about secret excavations in Spain. Military cordons, vanished photographs, and silent witnesses sound like the beginning of a thriller. But archaeological sites are often closed for very earthly reasons. There may be cave-ins, toxic gases, unstable structures, or dangerous unexploded ordnance. The most dangerous thing underground is often not the secret. The most dangerous thing is what cannot be seen. Carbon dioxide, methane, and hydrogen sulfide accumulate in old mines. They cause dizziness, weakness, and loss of consciousness. In flooded spaces, metal deteriorates quickly. Stone vaults crack. One wrong step can bring down a tunnel. There is another popular motif. The great fires of the 19th century. London, Chicago, Hamburg, Moscow, and other cities truly endured devastating fire disasters. The causes are well known. Dense development, wood, open flames, poor water supply, and strong winds could turn a small fire into a catastrophe. After such tragedies, cities were rebuilt, old districts were demolished, streets were widened, new building regulations were introduced. Underground, foundations, basements, wells, and forgotten passages were discovered. These are not necessarily traces of a destroyed civilization. Most often they are the ordinary history of a city that changed its appearance many times. Yet there is a real drama of its own in these discoveries. Every buried basement preserves the lives of earlier generations. Shards of dishes, coins, traces of stoves, children's toys, pieces of door hardware. Sometimes archaeologists find keys of unusually large size, but such a key could have opened warehouse gates, a church door, a grill, or a service hatch. A key was not always just a key. In complex locks, it worked as part of the mechanism. It lifted bolts, released springs, and shifted heavy pins. That is why some examples look more like machine parts. This does not make them mystical. On the contrary, it shows the ingenuity of past craftsmen. A massive door without visible hinges does not have to be a mystery either. The hinges could have been concealed inside the wall. The door could have moved along grooves. It could have been held by pins, axles, or stone guides. Many engineering solutions seem impossible until all elements of the construction are found. Too many keys have been lost. Too many passages have been walled up. But that is precisely what makes old cities so captivating. Beneath our streets lie not answers to every fantastic theory. There lies the genuine history of labor, fear, wars, fires, and human ingenuity. And perhaps the most important door in this story is not opened by a giant key. It is opened by patience. Archives, too many archival files end in the same way. Pages are missing. Photographs disappear. Reports of discoveries that supposedly did not fit the familiar picture of the past vanish. And almost always, one theme emerges alongside them: underground structures, heavy doors, and keys that look too large for an ordinary person. Some antique keys truly astonish with their size, but a large key by itself does not prove the existence of an unknown civilization. Massive locks were used in fortresses, monasteries, and warehouses. They protected gates, armories, and storerooms. Turning such mechanisms sometimes required both hands, a lever, or a special crank. Yet the question remains: why install doors underground that are difficult for even several people to move? Perhaps they separated more than just rooms. In old mines, tunnels, and military facilities, airtight barriers protected against smoke, such structures could withstand pressure or seal off a dangerous section. If giant locks are viewed from this perspective, they no longer seem mystical, but they still provoke unease, especially when legends are recalled of black storms, hot dust, and cities that suddenly became empty. Myths of a great fire exist among many peoples. In some tales, ash falls from the sky. In others, the earth rumbles and opens up. Somewhere people escape to the mountains or retreat into caves. Such stories could have arisen after eruptions, fires, earthquakes, and wars. Human memory can turn a real catastrophe into a legend. But one image often recurs in these legends: closed gates underground. It is important to remember, no such story by itself is considered proof of a global catastrophe. Historians need dates, independent examinations, documents, and accessible artifacts. Without them, even the most spectacular version remains a hypothesis. Sometimes an honest one, sometimes too convenient for those who want to see a secret in every old stone. And yet there are stories that are hard to forget. In the middle of the last century, rumors circulated in the Carpathians about a group of speleologists. Supposedly, deep in a cave they found a metal passageway. The door was covered with mineral deposits. A huge key lay nearby. According to later retellings, the researchers began cleaning the lock. Warm air came out through the cracks. After that, the expedition was allegedly stopped. There is no reliably published report of this story. No verifiable photographs. No list of participants or exact coordinates. Therefore, it cannot be taken as fact. But one phrase from the retellings is more gripping than anything else. The door was not locked from the outside, it was locked from the inside. If this is true, the meaning changes completely. Someone was not trying to keep danger inside. Someone was trying to survive the danger outside. What could such gates have been protecting against? Fire? A collapse? Poisoned air? Or people who could no longer enter? Ancient European legends offer their own grim answer. In the Alps, there are tales of sealed passages where a rumble can sometimes be heard. In the Balkans, there are stories of iron doors in the mountains. People are forbidden to open them during thunderstorms. In some villages, they speak of lower gates. They must not be disturbed except in extreme necessity. Folklore does not replace archaeology, but it does show what people feared. Sometimes a legend preserves a trace of a long-forgotten event. Sometimes it is merely fear of darkness, depth, and the unknown. By the way, if you are interested in details like these, here, we separate real historical facts from legends, rumors, and the boldest versions of the past. The keys from Bohemian monasteries are discussed separately. Some retellings claim that a cavity was found inside one massive shaft. Supposedly it contained a thin cylinder covered in tiny markings. Not paper, not ordinary metal. Something strange and incomprehensible. Then the story becomes almost cinematic. The artifact is taken to a restricted laboratory. The results are never published. Then an employee disappears. After that, a fire breaks out in the archive building. But this is exactly where we should stop. Such chains of events often exist only in retellings. A fire in an archive does not necessarily mean knowledge is being concealed. A restricted laboratory may simply be a laboratory with limited access, and a missing document may turn out to have been incorrectly described or lost long ago. The mystery begins where the facts end, and that is what lovers of sensational stories exploit. But the objects themselves do not disappear. Old doors are found in the underground chambers of fortresses. Massive locks turn up in monasteries. In Europe and Asia, keys are found with long shafts, heavy bits, and complex protrusions. Archaeologists explain them for entirely earthly reasons. Different craftsmen solved similar engineering problems. A thick door required a reliable lock. A reliable lock required a large key. Trade, wars, and migrations spread successful designs far from the places where they first appeared. And yet the similarity of such objects makes one think, not about some secret global civilization, at the very least, about how closely connected the old world was. People traveled, exchanged technologies, and copied successful mechanisms far more actively than we tend to imagine. The Middle Ages were not a motionless era. Craftsmen moved from city to city. Merchants carried goods and knowledge. Military engineers served different rulers. Stonemasons, blacksmiths, and weaponsmiths guarded professional secrets, yet still learned from one another. There is another troubling sign. At some underground sites, traces of intense heat are found. Stone darkens. Metal deforms. Surfaces appear melted, but the causes may vary. A fire, an explosion in a gunpowder store, the operation of furnaces, natural heat in volcanic regions, even a mistaken visual assessment. To determine the origin of such traces, laboratory analysis is needed, not an impression from a photograph. In the early 1930s, in Romania, according to one legend, workers were reinforcing a slope near an old fortress. After heavy rains, the ground collapsed. An underground corridor opened up. At first they thought it was an ordinary catacomb, but the workers quickly refused to go down. They heard a dull noise. The air seemed dry and warm. Their torches burned poorly. On the third day, the story claims, they saw a gate more than 5 meters high inside the tunnel. At the center of its doors was an enormous lock, and nearby, beneath stone rubble, lay a key. Only 3 men together were able to lift it. Later, the tunnel was supposedly blown up. The official reason sounded mundane, a risk of collapse. This is entirely possible. Old underground voids are dangerous. They collapse without warning. But another detail survived in the retellings. A letter from an engineer who took part in the work. We found a door that people feared to open even before us. Verifying the authenticity of this phrase is extremely difficult. Perhaps the letter never existed at all. Perhaps it was distorted dozens of times. But the image itself works flawlessly. A door the ancestors did not open. A door before which modern people stopped. That is why giant keys stir the imagination so deeply. They do not look like household objects. They resemble permission. The right to enter a place where entry has long been forbidden. Old maps are also often cited as evidence of a lost era. They show large squares, broad streets, and imposing buildings. It seems strange that such cities could have existed in a poor age, when most people traveled on foot or by horse. But the size of a city on a map does not always reflect its population. A cartographer may have exaggerated the importance of a capital. An artist may have drawn symbols rather than an exact plan. A wide square may have served as a market, a place for gathering troops, or a defensive zone in front of a fortress. And yet one question remains honest. How much do we really know about the people who built these tunnels, gates, and complex locks? We often look at an ancient structure and see only stone, but behind it are calculations. The extraction of materials, transportation, the work of blacksmiths, drainage, ventilation, protection from water. All of this required experience, discipline, and time. The past does not have to be fantastic to be astonishing. Perhaps the enormous keys do not conceal a secret of the end of the world. Perhaps they opened warehouses, shelters, prisons, or military passages. But even such an answer does not make them any less important. They remind us of something else. People of the past knew how to build for centuries. They prepared for sieges, fires, famine, and wars. They locked doors not for the sake of a beautiful legend. They knew that one day, outside could become more dangerous than inside. And some doors remain locked to this day. Behind them there may be empty corridors, collapsed rooms, traces of an old mine, or documents that would change only one small detail of a familiar story. But as long as the key lies in the earth and the lock remains hidden beneath stone, humanity retains the right to ask questions. And perhaps the most important of them sounds like this. Are we ready to learn why these doors were once locked from the inside?